June 1944. Three German soldiers stood in a Canadian prisoner processing camp, their nerves raw, their minds racing. They had survived the chaos of Normandy, the thunder of Allied guns, and the terror of capture. Now, as they waited in line, something happened that made their world tilt on its axis. A Canadian guard, tall and broad-shouldered, leaned over to speak with another prisoner. But it was the English they expected. It wasn't even the broken, heavily accented German they'd heard from other Allied troops. No, this was flawless, high German, the kind you'd hear in the heart of Berlin or Munich. The words rolled out with perfect clarity, every syllable crisp and familiar. The three men exchanged glances, their faces a mix of confusion and disbelief. Weren't these supposed to be the brutal colonials? The so-called barbarians from a frozen wilderness, barely able to speak English, let alone German. That's what the propaganda had drilled into them for years. The Canadians, they'd been told, were merciless. They were primitive, uncultured, and driven by a hatred for everything German. Surrender meant torture, humiliation, maybe even death. Better to die fighting than fall into their hands. But here, in the heart of enemy territory, a guard spoke their mother tongue as naturally as breathing. It was a small moment, but it shattered something deep inside. If the enemy could sound like a neighbor, what else had they been wrong about? What these three soldiers didn't know was that this was just the beginning. Within weeks, they would find themselves sitting in Canadian farmhouses, eating meals with civilians who looked like their enemies but sounded like old friends from home. They would work side by side with men who shared their language, their customs, even their jokes. The lines between us and them would blur, then vanish. For these German prisoners, the war was supposed to be black and white, good versus evil, civilization versus savagery. But as the days passed, the world they thought they knew would unravel, thread by thread. Every certainty would be challenged. Every belief would be tested. And in the end, the greatest battle wouldn't be fought with guns or tanks, but inside their own minds. This is the story of how three German soldiers, captured by the Allies and shipped across the Atlantic, discovered a truth more shocking than any battlefield defeat. It's a story about propaganda, identity, and the power of unexpected kindness. And it all began with a single, perfect sentence spoken in German by a Canadian guard who was supposed to be their enemy. But that was only the first crack in the wall. What happened next would turn their world upside down and reveal a side of America's northern neighbor that few in the U.S. have ever heard about. For years, German soldiers had been fed a steady diet of fear. Nazi propaganda painted a terrifying picture of the Allies, especially the Canadians and Americans. The message was clear: if you're captured, expect the worst. The enemy, they were told, was ruthless, brutal colonials from distant lands driven by revenge and hatred. In the barracks, on the front lines, and in every official speech, the warnings were the same. The Allies will torture you. They'll starve you. They'll execute you without mercy. The Canadians, in particular, were described as wild men from a frozen wasteland, barely civilized, eager to destroy everything German. Surrender, the propaganda insisted, was a fate worse than death. But as the days unfolded after their capture, the reality these German soldiers faced was nothing like the nightmare they'd been promised. Instead of beatings, they were given water. Instead of jeers, they received bandages for their wounds. The first shock came in the form of simple human kindness, a Canadian medic kneeling beside a wounded prisoner, cleaning a shrapnel wound with gentle hands. Another guard, bored and tired, handed out bread and coffee, not insults. The prisoners waited for the cruelty to begin, but it never came. The confusion grew with every passing hour. When the prisoners were processed, they were searched, yes, but not humiliated. Their personal belongings were catalogued, not stolen. They were given clean clothes, treated for lice, and examined by medical officers. One young German, Klaus, had expected to lose his leg to infection. Instead, a Canadian doctor stitched the wound and changed the bandages twice a day. "Why are they helping us?" he whispered to a fellow prisoner. No one had an answer. The journey to Canada only deepened the mystery. Packed onto a ship with hundreds of other POWs, the Germans braced themselves for misery. But the ship was organized, the bunks were clean, and the food, 3 meals a day, was more than they'd eaten in weeks on the front. Porridge, bread, hot soup, even coffee. The guards didn't shout or threaten. They looked homesick, just like the prisoners. When seasickness struck, a guard brought medicine and a bucket, not a kick or a curse. Whispers spread through the darkened bunks at night. "Maybe this is a trick," some muttered. "They're fattening us up before the real punishment begins." Others wondered if it was psychological warfare, a way to break their spirits with unexpected kindness. But for many, the seeds of doubt had been planted. If the enemy wasn't a monster, what else had they been lied to about? As the ship crossed the Atlantic, the German prisoners stared at the endless gray waves and wondered what waited for them in this mysterious land called Canada. Would it be the icy hell they'd been warned about? Or was something even more unsettling happening? A slow, relentless unraveling of everything they thought they knew. The truth was, the real battle was just beginning. Not on the front lines, but inside their own minds. And as the coast of North America finally appeared on the horizon, one question echoed in every heart. If the enemy could show mercy, what else was possible? And what did that mean for everything they'd been taught to believe? When the ship finally docked in Halifax, the German prisoners pressed against the rails, desperate for a glimpse of the land they'd been taught to fear. The first thing they saw wasn't a frozen wasteland or a battered war zone. It was a bustling harbor, alive with ships and cranes, workers shouting orders, and the distant hum of city life. The air was crisp, but not the bone-chilling cold they'd imagined. Instead, it carried the scent of the sea and the promise of something entirely unexpected. As the prisoners were marched through the city, their eyes darted from one sight to the next. Storefronts gleamed with goods in the windows. Children played on street corners, their laughter echoing through the clean, orderly streets. Civilians strolled by in well-kept clothes, some even driving shiny automobiles, an unimaginable luxury in war-torn Europe. For these German soldiers, it was like stepping into another world, one untouched by the devastation they'd left behind. The journey didn't end in Halifax. The prisoners were loaded onto passenger trains, not cattle cars, but real trains with padded seats and wide windows. As the train rolled westward, the landscape unfolded in a way that defied every expectation. Endless forests stretched to the horizon, broken by neat farms and tidy towns. Each village boasted a church steeple, rows of painted houses, and streets that looked as if they'd never seen a bomb or a tank. The further they traveled, the more the myth of a harsh, primitive Canada crumbled. Meals were served at regular intervals: sandwiches, fresh fruit, hot coffee. The guards, far from being cruel, were almost invisible, quietly doing their jobs. At one stop, Canadian soldiers boarded the train, laughing and joking, their uniforms crisp and their faces confident. They looked nothing like the desperate, hollow-eyed men the Germans had seen on the front lines. Here was a country at war, but not at the edge of collapse. Here was a nation that seemed to thrive even as the world burned. For the German prisoners, every mile brought new questions. How could a land so far from the chaos of Europe be so prosperous, so peaceful? How could farmers afford cars, when in Germany only the wealthy had such things? Why did the guards treat them with a kind of distant professionalism, rather than hatred or contempt. The answers didn't come easily, but the doubts grew louder with every passing day. When the train finally slowed near a small Ontario town called Bowmanville, the prisoners braced themselves for the worst. Instead, they found themselves entering a camp that looked more like a military base than a prison. Barracks stood in neat rows, surrounded by fields of corn and grazing cows. The air was fresh, the land green and alive. The camp commandant addressed them in German, explaining the rules and their rights under the Geneva Convention. Each man received clothing, blankets, and a wooden box for personal items. The message was clear: you are prisoners, but you will be treated with dignity. For men who had been told to expect brutality, this was the greatest shock of all. As they settled into their new lives behind barbed wire, one thought echoed in every mind. If this was the enemy, what did that make them? And if everything they'd been told was a lie, what else was waiting to be discovered in this strange, generous land called Canada, America's neighbor, but a world apart? Inside the Canadian camp, the German prisoners braced themselves for hardship. But what they found was a daily routine that felt almost surreal. Each morning, sunlight streamed through glass windows, real glass, not the drafty, broken panes they'd known in Europe. The barracks were heated, the bunks had thick mattresses, and every man had his own space. For soldiers used to sleeping in muddy trenches or overcrowded shelters, it was a shock to the system. The first meal set the tone. In the mess hall, long tables groaned under the weight of food: pork, potatoes, carrots, thick slices of bread with real butter, and steaming mugs of coffee. For dessert, apples, fresh, crisp, and sweet. The prisoners ate slowly, almost in disbelief. Some couldn't finish their plates; their bodies simply weren't used to so much food. The daily ration was 3,000 calories, the same as Canadian soldiers. For men who had starved on the front lines, it felt like a feast. Medical care was another revelation. When Klaus, the young factory worker from Stuttgart, limped into the clinic, a Canadian doctor examined his leg with gentle hands. Medicine and clean bandages were provided without question or cost. When another prisoner collapsed with appendicitis, guards rushed him to a civilian hospital. He returned 2 weeks later, fully healed. The message was clear: even as prisoners, their lives mattered. Work assignments began soon after. Some men stayed in camp, repairing buildings or tending gardens. Others, like Ernst, were sent to local farms. That's where the real surprises began. On his first day, Ernst met Jacob Rimpel, a Canadian farmer who greeted him in perfect German. "Guten Morgen, Männer. Welcome to my farm." Ernst froze, stunned. How could a Canadian speak his language so well? The answer was even more shocking. Rimpel was a Mennonite, part of a community of German-speaking Canadians whose families had fled Europe decades earlier. They had built new lives in Canada, thriving in freedom and prosperity. At lunch, Rimpel's wife, Maria, brought out food and spoke to the prisoners in their own dialect. She smiled and offered extra bread, just like a neighbor back home. Ernst's mind reeled. Nazi propaganda had insisted that Germans abroad were oppressed, desperate for rescue. But here was a family living in comfort, speaking German openly, owning land, and enjoying rights that most Germans could only dream of. Back in camp, the surprises kept coming. The library was stocked with German books, no political texts, but plenty of literature and history. The recreation yard had a soccer ball and a volleyball net. Prisoners could earn small wages for their work, spend it at the canteen, and even write letters home. The guards were professional, distant, but never cruel. Some even chatted with the prisoners about sports or the weather, their tone more bored than hostile. The biggest shock, though, was the sense of normalcy. The camp ran on order and routine, not fear. The prisoners were expected to follow rules, but they were treated as men, not animals. For many, it was the first time in years they felt truly human. As the weeks passed, the German POWs began to question everything. If the enemy could show this much decency, what else had they been wrong about? And if German-speaking families could thrive in Canada, what did that say about the world they'd left behind? The answers weren't easy, but one thing was certain. Life in the Canadian camp was nothing like the nightmare they'd been promised. It was, in many ways, the beginning of a new kind of freedom, one that would change them forever. And just when they thought they'd seen it all, a single invitation would push their transformation even further, forcing them to confront the truth about everything they believed. For months, the German prisoners had lived in a world that defied everything they'd been taught. But the true breaking point came on a crisp September day, when Ernst and his work crew received an invitation that would change their lives forever. Jacob Rimpel, the Mennonite farmer, asked them to join his family for a traditional harvest celebration, a festival of gratitude called Erntedankfest. The idea seemed impossible. Prisoners, invited to a civilian gathering. It was unheard of, even in the most generous stories whispered among the men. The camp commandant approved the request, and on the day of the festival, 12 German POWs climbed into a truck, their hearts pounding with a mix of hope and suspicion. As they arrived at the Rimpel farm, the scene before them was almost dreamlike. Long tables stretched across the yard, covered in white cloths and overflowing with food: roast pork, fresh bread, apple pies, and homemade noodles. Families gathered, speaking German and English in a seamless blend. Children played, their laughter ringing out in both languages. The air was filled with the scent of baking and the sound of hymns, familiar, yet impossibly far from the war-torn world they'd left behind. Ernst was greeted by Heinrich Rimpel, Jacob's elderly father, who shook his hand and welcomed him in the dialect of his home region. "Sit, eat, you are safe here." The words hit harder than any bullet. As the meal began, the prisoners ate slowly, savoring every bite. Some wept quietly, overwhelmed by the abundance and the kindness. Klaus whispered, "My mother hasn't cooked a meal like this in 5 years." The contrast with Germany's hunger and fear was almost too much to bear. After the meal, Heinrich stood to speak. He told the story of leaving Germany decades earlier, seeking freedom and opportunity in Canada. "Germany was my birthplace, but Canada became my home," he said. "Here we built a life with our own hands. Here we found true freedom." His words shattered the myth of the oppressed German abroad. These families had not been rescued by the Reich. They had fled it, and in Canada, they had found everything the Nazis had promised but never delivered. For Ernst, the dam finally broke. Every belief he had carried into the war, about race, about enemies, about the righteousness of his cause, collapsed in that moment. He felt tears on his face and didn't try to hide them. Maria Rimpel, seeing his distress, sat beside him and offered a small package: cookies, soap, and writing paper. "For you and your friends," she said gently, in the low German of his childhood. The simple kindness from someone he'd been taught to hate was more devastating than any punishment. Klaus spent the afternoon playing soccer with the Rimpel children, switching between German and English as easily as breathing. Friedrich talked politics with young Canadian men, learning about democracy, free speech, and the rights of citizens. The prisoners realized that these German Canadians were more free, more prosperous, and more secure than anyone they'd left behind in the Reich. That night back in the barracks, the men struggled to put their feelings into words. Some clung to old beliefs, insisting it was all a trick. But for Ernst, Klaus, and Friedrich, there was no going back. The truth was undeniable. Everything they'd been taught was a lie. The enemy was not a monster. The world was not as simple as they'd been told, and in the heart of Canada they had found a kind of freedom that no regime could ever promise. This was the moment their war truly ended, not with a surrender but with an awakening. And as the days grew shorter and the leaves turned gold, the question that haunted them was no longer, "Who is the enemy?" but "Who am I now?" As autumn deepened in Ontario, the German prisoners found themselves living in two worlds. By day, they worked on Canadian farms, learned new skills, and shared meals with families who spoke their language and offered unexpected kindness. By night, they returned to the barracks, haunted by memories of home and the growing realization that everything they'd believed was unraveling. Letters from Germany arrived sporadically, each one a window into a country collapsing under the weight of war. Ernst's wife wrote in careful, coded language about air raids, food shortages, and neighbors who had vanished. Klaus received word that his father had been killed in a bombing raid. The grief was overwhelming, but so was the confusion. Who was to blame? The Allies who dropped the bombs, or the regime that had started the war and brought destruction to their doorstep? The lines between victim and perpetrator blurred, leaving only questions and guilt. Inside the camp, the prisoners split into factions. The hardliners clung to Nazi ideology, insisting that the good treatment was a trick, a sign of Allied weakness. They held secret meetings, threatened those who questioned, and kept lists of traitors. But for men like Ernst, Klaus, and Friedrich, the old certainties had crumbled. They joined small discussion groups, quietly sharing their doubts and observations. They read Canadian newspapers, learned about democracy, and began to see the world through new eyes. The true reckoning came in the spring of 1945. Rumors swept through Camp 20. Hitler was dead, Germany had surrendered, the war was over. Relief mingled with dread. What would become of them now? The answer came in the form of a mandatory assembly. The Canadian Guards set up a projector and played footage from the newly liberated concentration camps. The images were beyond anything the prisoners could have imagined. Skeletal bodies, mass graves, survivors with haunted eyes. The truth of the Holocaust was undeniable, seared into their memories forever. Ernst wrote in his diary, "I cannot find words. My hands shake. We did this. I wore that uniform." Klaus refused to eat for days, racked with guilt. Friedrich sat in silence, trying to understand how a nation could descend into such evil. Some prisoners denied what they saw, calling it Allied propaganda. But for most, the evidence was overwhelming. The guilt was crushing. In the weeks that followed, the men struggled to process what they had learned. The Canadian chaplain told them, "You cannot change the past, but you can choose what kind of man you become from this day forward." Ernst attended every discussion, desperate to find a way forward. Klaus threw himself into work, trying to drown out the memories. Friedrich wrote page after page, searching for meaning in the ruins of his beliefs. As the Canadian government began processing prisoners for return to Germany, the three friends made a pact. "Whatever happens, we will remember the truth. We will not let ourselves forget what we learned here." They understood now that the real prison had never been the barbed wire or the guards. It was the lies they had believed, the hatred they had carried, and the ignorance that had blinded them. For these men, the reckoning was not just about guilt. It was about transformation. They had been captured as enemies, but they would return home as something entirely different, witnesses to the power of truth, and proof that even in the darkest times, humanity can break through. And as they prepared to leave Canada, one question remained. Could they help rebuild a broken world with the lessons they had learned in captivity? When the war finally ended, the journey home began, not just for Ernst, Klaus, and Friedrich, but for thousands of German POWs scattered across North America. The Canadian camps, once places of fear and confusion, now felt strangely safe. The prospect of returning to Germany, a land shattered by years of war, filled many with dread. The men packed their few belongings, letters, diaries, small gifts from Canadian friends, and boarded trains bound for Halifax, retracing the route that had once brought them to captivity. The Atlantic crossing was somber. The ship was quieter, the men older and changed. As the German coast came into view, the reality of what awaited them hit hard. Cities that had once been vibrant centers of life were now fields of rubble. Streets were lined with ruins, the air thick with the smell of ash and desperation. Families were scattered, homes destroyed, and hunger was everywhere. The contrast with Canada's abundance was impossible to ignore. Ernst found his wife and children in rural Bavaria, living with relatives in a house crowded with refugees. His children barely recognized him. His wife, aged by years of fear and deprivation, struggled to understand the man who had returned, a man who questioned everything, who spoke of kindness from the enemy, who carried a Canadian flag and a recipe for cookies from a Mennonite farm. The reunion was bittersweet, marked by relief, but also by the distance that war and transformation had created. Klaus returned to Stuttgart, where his mother lived in a displaced persons camp. He used the skills he'd learned in Canada, carpentry, English, and a new sense of hope, to find work with the British occupation forces. He dreamed of a better life, and when the chance came, he immigrated to Canada, sponsored by the Rimpel family. There, he built a new home, married, and raised children who grew up speaking both German and English, living proof that enemies could become neighbors. Friedrich settled in the ruins of Hamburg, working by day and studying by night. He poured his energy into understanding democracy, writing letters to Canadian friends, and eventually earning a doctorate in political science. His work, shaped by the lessons of captivity, helped lay the foundation for a new, democratic Germany. He became a voice for reconciliation, reminding his countrymen that true strength comes not from fear, but from freedom and truth. The legacy of these men reached far beyond their own families. The stories they shared, the values they brought home, and the questions they asked helped shape the post-war world. In classrooms, on farms, and in city councils, they taught that propaganda can be defeated by reality, that kindness can heal even the deepest wounds, and that the line between enemy and friend is never as clear as it seems. For American viewers, the story of these German POWs in Canada is a powerful reminder of the values that define the best of the West: freedom, dignity, and the courage to question. It's a story about the power of second chances, the importance of truth, and the hope that even in the darkest times people can change. The camps are gone, but the lessons remain, echoing across generations and borders. As Ernst once wrote in his diary, Canada was real. This is real. The contrast shows what is possible. And for those who wonder if enemies can ever become friends, the answer lies in the lives of men who returned from captivity not just changed, but transformed, ready to build a better world, one truth at a time. In the end, the story of German POWs in Canada is more than a tale of war and captivity. It's a testament to the power of truth, the resilience of the human spirit, and the unexpected ways that enemies can become allies. For American viewers, this story holds a mirror to the values that have shaped the United States: the belief in second chances, the strength found in diversity, and the conviction that freedom is worth fighting for, not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of every individual. What began with fear and suspicion ended with understanding and transformation. Ernst, Klaus, and Friedrich arrived in Canada as soldiers of a defeated regime, burdened by propaganda and hardened by loss. But through the simple acts of kindness from Canadian guards, the generosity of Mennonite farmers, and the daily experience of dignity and respect, they discovered a new way of seeing the world. The enemy was not a monster, but a neighbor. The other side was not a land of savages, but a place where democracy, opportunity, and compassion thrived. The lessons they carried home were not just for themselves, but for a world struggling to rebuild. They taught their children to question, to seek truth, and to never accept hatred as destiny. They became teachers, builders, and leaders, living proof that even the deepest wounds can heal, and that the future is not written by the victors alone, but by those who choose to learn and grow from the past. For Americans, this story is a reminder that the values we hold dear, freedom of speech, the rule of law, the right to dissent, are not just slogans, but lifelines for those searching for hope in the darkest times. It's a call to remember that the real strength of a nation is measured not by its weapons, but by its willingness to extend a hand to the stranger, the former enemy, the lost. As the years passed, the legacy of those Canadian camps echoed across continents. Former prisoners became citizens, neighbors, and friends. Their children visited the farms where their fathers once worked as captives, now welcomed as guests. The Rempel family story, and those like it, became bridges between worlds once divided by war. So what can we take from this today? In a world still marked by conflict and division, the story of German POWs in Canada is a powerful reminder that change is possible. That truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. That kindness, even in the smallest acts, can break the chains of hate and fear. And that sometimes the greatest victories are not won on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments when we choose to see the humanity in one another. If you found this story as eye-opening as we did, don't forget to subscribe for more untold histories and powerful lessons from the past. And if you're curious about how these stories connect to American experiences, immigration, reconciliation, and the ongoing fight for freedom, let us know in the comments below. Because history isn't just about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember and how we use those memories to build a better future. Thanks for watching, and remember, the real enemy is ignorance. The real victory is understanding, and the real legacy is the courage to change.